Hello, continuing to read from the text, Communication in the Real World, an Introduction to Communication Studies. This is Chapter 1, Section 4, the final section of Chapter 1, and it's about 10 pages. Communication Competence, Learning Objectives. 1. Define communication competence. 2. Explain each part of the definition of communication competence. 3. Discuss strategies for developing communication competence. 4. Discuss communication apprehension and public speaking anxiety and employ strategies to manage them. Communication competence has become a focus in higher education over the past couple of decades, as educational policymakers and advocates have stressed a back-to-basics mentality. The ability to communicate effectively is often included as a primary undergraduate learning goal, along with other key skills like writing, critical thinking, and problem solving. You likely haven't heard professors or university administrators use the term communication competence, but as we learn more about it in this section, I am sure you will see how communication competence can benefit you in many aspects of your life. Since this book focuses on communication in the real world, strategies for developing communication competence are not only limited to this section. A Getting Competent feature box is included in each chapter specifically to help you develop communication competence. Defining competence. We have already defined communication, and you probably know that to be competent at something means you know what you're doing. When we combine these terms, we get the following definition. Communication competence refers to the knowledge of effective and appropriate communication patterns and the ability to use and adapt that knowledge in various contexts. To better understand this definition, let's break apart its components. Just as an aside, as I'm reading this, I have a specialty in working in the behavioral health field, and I think a lot about autistic people and how some of what's in this text would be especially challenging for certain people with mental illnesses and certainly with autism. The first part of the definition we will unpack deals with knowledge. The cognitive elements of competence include knowing how to do something and understanding why things are done the way they are. People can develop cognitive competence by observing and evaluating the actions of others. Cognitive competence can also be developed through instruction. Since you are currently taking a communication class, I encourage you to try to observe the communication concepts you are learning in the communication practices of others and yourself. This will help bring the concepts to life and also help you evaluate how communication in the real world matches up with communication concepts. As you build a repertoire of communication knowledge, based on your experiential and classroom knowledge, you will also be developing behavioral competence. The second part of the definition of communication competence that we will unpack is the ability to use. Individual factors affect our ability to do anything. Not everyone has the same athletic, musical, or intellectual ability. At the individual level, a person's physiological and psychological characteristics affect competence. In terms of physiology, age, maturity, and ability to communicate affect competence. In terms of psychology, a person's mood, stress level, personality, and level of communication apprehension, level of anxiety regarding communication, affect competence. All these factors will either help or hinder you when you try to apply the knowledge you have learned to actual communication behaviors. For example, you might know strategies for being an effective speaker, but public speaking anxiety that kicks in when you get in front of the audience may prevent you from fully putting that knowledge into practice. The third part of the definition we will unpack is ability to adapt to various contexts. What is competent or not varies based on social and cultural context, which makes it impossible to have only one standard for what counts as communication competence. Social variables such as status and power affect competence. In a social situation where one person, say a supervisor, has more power than another, for example, his or her employee, then the supervisor is typically the one who sets the standard for competence. Cultural variables such as race and nationality also affect competence. A Taiwanese woman who speaks English as her second language may be praised for her competence in the English language in her home country, but be viewed as less competent in the United States because of her accent. In summary, although we have a clear definition of communication competence, there are not definitions for how to be competent in any given situation, since competence varies at the individual, social, and cultural level. Despite the fact that no guidelines for or definitions of competence will be applicable in all situations, the National Communication Association has identified many aspects of competence related to communication. The primary focus has been on competencies related to speaking and listening, and the NCA notes that developing communication competence in these areas will help people in academic, professional, and civic contexts. To help colleges and universities develop curriculum and instruction strategies to prepare students, the NCA has defined what students should be able to do in terms of speaking and listening competencies by the time they graduate from college. 1. State ideas clearly. 2. Communicate ethically. 3. Recognize when it is appropriate to communicate. 4. Identify their communication goals. 5. Select the most appropriate and effective medium for communicating. 6. Demonstrate credibility. 7. Identify and manage misunderstandings. 8. Manage conflict. 9. Be open-minded about another's point of view. 10. Listen attentively. These are just some of the competencies the NCA identified as important for college graduates. While these are skill-focused rather than interpersonally or culturally focused, they provide a concrete way to assess your own speaking competencies and to prepare yourself for professional speaking and listening, which is often skill-driven. Since we communicate in many different contexts, such as interpersonal, group, intercultural, and mediated, we will discuss more specific definitions of competence in later sections of the book. Developing competence. Knowing the dimensions of competence is an important first step towards developing competence. Everyone reading this book already has some experience with and knowledge about communication. After all, you've spent many years explicitly and implicitly learning to communicate. For example, we are explicitly taught the verbal codes we use to communicate. On the other hand, although there are numerous rules and norms associated with nonverbal communication, we rarely receive explicit instruction on how to do it. Instead, we learn by observing others and through trial and error with our own nonverbal communication. Competence obviously involves verbal and nonverbal elements, but it also applies to many situations and contexts. Communication competence is needed in order to understand communication ethics, to develop cultural awareness, to use computer-mediated communication, and to think critically. Competence involves knowledge, motivation, and skills. It's not enough to know what good communication consists of. You must also have the motivation to reflect on and better your communication and the skills needed to do so. In regards to competence, we all have areas where we are skilled and areas where we have deficiencies. In most cases, we can consciously decide to work on our deficiencies, which may take considerable effort. There are multiple stages of competence that I challenge you to assess as you communicate in your daily life. Unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscious competence, and unconscious competence. Before you have built up a rich cognitive knowledge base of communication concepts and practiced and reflected on skills in a particular area, you may exhibit unconscious incompetence, which means you are not even aware that you are communicating in an incompetent manner. Once you learn more about communication and have a vocabulary to identify concepts, you may find yourself exhibiting conscious incompetence. This is where you know what you should be doing and you realize you're not doing it as well as you could. However, as your skills increase, you may advance to conscious competence, meaning that you know you are communicating well in the moment, which will add to your bank of experience to draw from in future interactions. When you reach the stage of unconscious competence, you just communicate successfully without straining to be competent. Just because you reach the stage of unconscious competence in one area or with one person does not mean you will always stay there. We are faced with new communication encounters regularly, and although we may be able to draw on the communication skills we have learned about and developed, it may take a few instances of conscious incompetence before you can advance to later stages. I'm going to comment here on a model that I will apply to someone who is maybe a licensed contractor, wants to become an expert at something. The stage here of unconscious incompetence is a stage where unconscious incompetence basically says, you don't know what you don't know. And then once you advance from the stage of a complete novice to someone who's learning about a trade, for example, the conscious incompetence is basically like saying, you know what you don't know. And then you get to the stage of conscious competence, which is another way of saying, you know what you know. And that's when you can become a journeyman, for example, the old term of a licensed contractor. And then you get to the stage of unconscious competence, and that's another way of saying you don't know what you know. In other words, you become an expert. So again, you don't know what you don't know. Then you advance from that novice stage to becoming an apprentice, as it were. And you know what you don't know. You know what you have to learn. And then you become someone who can be independent and maybe what you would call a licensed contractor or a journeyman, and you know what you know, but the stage that exceeds that is the expert stage, and the expert stage is where you can become so good at something that you don't even know what you know. And if somebody asked you why you did what you did because they considered you an expert, you wouldn't even be able to tell them because it's just how you do things. These are experts. In many introductory communication classes that I teach, a student usually says something like, you must be really good at this stuff since you study it and have been teaching it for a while. At the same time, students assume that I have a high level of communication competence. They are hard on themselves for being at the stage of conscious incompetence. In other words, you know what you don't know, where they catch themselves communicating poorly in regards to a concept we recently studied. In response to both of these comments, I say, just because I know the concepts and definitions doesn't mean I always put them to good use. We're all imperfect and fallible, and if we expect to be perfect communicators after studying this, then we're setting ourselves up for failure. However, when I do mess up, I almost always make a mental note and reflect on it. And now you're starting to do the same thing, which is to notice and reflect on your communication more. And that already puts you ahead of most people. One way to progress towards communication competence is to become a more mindful communicator. A mindful communicator actively and fluidly processes information. is sensitive to communication contexts and multiple perspectives, and is able to adapt to novel communication situations. Becoming a more mindful communicator has many benefits, including achieving communication goals, detecting deception, avoiding stereotypes, and reducing conflict. Whether or not we achieve our day-to-day communication goals depends on our communication competence. Various communication behaviors can signal that we are communicating mindfully. For example, asking an employee to paraphrase their understanding of the instructions you just gave them shows that you are aware that verbal messages are not always clear, that people do not always listen actively, and that people often do not speak up when they are unsure of instructions for fear of appearing incompetent or embarrassing themselves. By the way, in the teaching profession, that's called for checking for understanding. Some communication behaviors indicate that we are not communicating mindfully, such as withdrawing from a romantic partner or engaging in passive-aggressive behavior during a period of interpersonal conflict. Most of us know that such behaviors lead to predictable and avoidable conflict cycles, yet we are all guilty of them. Our tendency to assume that people are telling us the truth can also lead to negative results. Therefore, a certain amount of tentativeness and mindful monitoring of a person's nonverbal and verbal communication can help us detect deception. However, this is not the same thing as chronic suspicion, which would not indicate communication competence. This is just the beginning of our conversation about communication competence. Regarding the previous examples, we will learn more about paraphrasing in Chapter 5, Listening, conflict management in Chapter 6, Interpersonal Communication Processes, and deception in Chapter 4, Nonverbal Communication. Getting competent. Getting started on your road to communication competence. The Getting Competent boxes throughout this book are meant to help you become a more confident and skilled communicator. While each box will focus on a specific aspect of communication competence, this box addresses communication competence more generally. A common communication pitfall that is an obstacle on many students' roads to communication competence is viewing communication as common sense. Many students note that some of what we learn in communication classes is common sense. I agree with this observation in some cases, but disagree with it in others. As I've noted before, this class builds on knowledge that you have already gained through experience and observation as a person with many years of communication under your belt. For example, a student might say that it is common sense that conflict avoidance can lead to build up tensions that eventually hurt an interpersonal relationship. But many of us avoid confronting what is causing conflict in our relationships, even though we know it's better to talk about our problems than to let them build up. In order to put that common sense knowledge to competent use, we must have a more nuanced understanding of how conflict and interpersonal communication relate and know something of conflict management strategies. Communication is common in that it is something that we spend most of our lives, most of our time doing, but the ability to make sense of and improve our communication takes competence that is learned through deliberate study and personal reflection. So to get started on your road to competence, I am proposing you do two things. First, challenge yourself to see the value in the study of communication. Apply the concepts we are learning to your life and find ways to make this class help you achieve your goals. Second, commit to using the knowledge you gain in this class to improve your communication and the communication of those around you. Become a higher self-monitor, which means start to notice your communication more. We all know areas where we could improve our communication, and taking this class will probably expose even more. But you have to be prepared to put in the time to improve. For example, it takes effort to become a better listener or to give better feedback. If you start these things now, you will be primed to take on more communication challenges that will be presented throughout this book. 3 questions. What aspect of communication do you think are common sense? What aspects of communication do you think require more formal instruction and/or study? Second, what communication concept has appealed to you most so far? How can you see this concept applying to your life? 3, do a communication self-assessment. What are your strengths as a communicator? What are your weaknesses? What can you do to start improving your communication competence? Overcoming anxiety. Whether you will give your first presentation in this class next week or in 2 months, you may be one of many students in the Introduction to Communication Studies course to face anxiety about communication in general or public speaking in particular. Decades of research conducted by communication scholars shows that communication apprehension is common among college students. Communication apprehension, abbreviated CA here, is fear or anxiety experienced by a person due to actual or imagined communication with another person or persons. Communication apprehension includes multiple forms of communication, not just public speaking. Of college students, 15 to 20% experience high trait communication apprehension, meaning they are generally anxious about communication. Furthermore, 70% of college students experience some trait communication apprehension, which means that addressing communication anxiety in a class like the one you're taking now stands to benefit the majority of students. Public speaking anxiety is a type of communication apprehension that produces physiological, cognitive, and behavioral reactions in people when faced with a real or imagined presentation. Research on public speaking anxiety has focused on 3 key ways to address this common issue: systematic desensitization, cognitive restructuring, and skills training. Communication departments are typically the only departments that address communication apprehension explicitly, which is important in communication apprehension is related to negative academic consequences such as negative attitudes towards school, lower overall classroom achievement, lower final course grades, and higher college attrition rates, meaning dropping out. Additionally, communication apprehension can lead others to make assumptions about your communication competence that may be unfavorable. Even if you are intelligent, prepared, and motivated, communication apprehension and public speaking anxiety can detract from your communication and lead others to perceive you in ways you did not intend. Communication apprehension is a common issue faced by many people, so you are not alone. We will learn more about speaking anxiety in Chapter 12, Public Speaking in Various Contexts. While you should feel free to read ahead to that chapter, you can also manage your anxiety by following some of the following tips. Top 10 ways to reduce speaking anxiety. 1. Remember, you are not alone. Public speaking anxiety is common, so don't ignore it. Confront it. 2. You can't literally die of embarrassment. Audiences are forgiving and understanding. 3. It always feels worse than it looks. 4. Take deep breaths. It releases endorphins, which naturally fight the adrenaline that causes anxiety. 5. Look the part. Dress professionally to enhance confidence. 6. Channel your nervousness into positive energy and motivation. 7. Start your outline and research early. Better information equals higher confidence. 8. Practice and get feedback from a trusted source. Don't just practice for your cat. 9. Visualize success through positive thinking. 10. Prepare, prepare, prepare. Practice is a speaker's best friend. Key takeaways. Communication competence refers to the knowledge of effective and appropriate communication patterns and the ability to use and adapt that knowledge in various contexts. To be a competent communicator, you should have cognitive knowledge about communication based on observation and instruction. Understand that individual, social, and cultural contexts affect competence and be able to adapt to those various contexts. Getting integrated. The NCA notes that developing communication competence in speaking and listening will help college students in academic, professional, and civic contexts. Levels of communication competence include unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscious competence, and unconscious competence. And again, there's a stage of that which is you don't know what you don't know, the novice or beginner. Conscious incompetence, the beginner basically taking their first step, so you know what you don't know. Conscious competence, meaning you know what you know, and the unconscious competence, which is basically mastery. You don't know what you know because you've become so good at it. In order to develop communication competence, you must become a more mindful communicator and a higher self-monitor. Communication apprehension refers to fear or anxiety experienced by a person due to real or imagined communication with another person or persons. Public speaking anxiety is a form of communication apprehension that more specifically focuses on anxiety about giving a public presentation. Both are commonly experienced by most people and can be managed using various strategies. Exercises. 1. Getting integrated. Evaluate your speaking and listening competencies based on the list generated by the NCA. Out of the skills listed, which ones are you more competent in and less competent in? Which skill will be most useful for you in academic contexts, professional contexts, personal contexts, civic contexts? 2. Think of a person you know who you think possesses a high level of communication competence. What makes you think this? What communication characteristics do they have that you might want to have yourself? 3. What anxieties do you have regarding communication and/or public speaking? Since communication and speaking are a necessary part of life, identify some strategies you can use to manage those anxieties. That's the end of the chapter, and we will go on to chapter 2. Thank you.